You don't know how scary it is to wear this in hopes that it doesn't turn on during singing. If you ever hear a solo from me, just tell me and I'll turn it back off. It's not on purpose. So I'm thankful that we know how to turn it off. It's good to see you all this morning. I do appreciate you being here. We're going to go back in time a little bit, and I want you to go ahead and open up your Bibles, if you would, to the book of Esther. To the book of Esther. And as you're turning over there, if you have trouble finding it, turn to Psalms and Job and around there, then flip back a couple of books and you'll find your way to it. We're going to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about something that is very ancient and also very modern on some of the problems that we deal with and problems we face. And that is the problem of sometimes of dealing with revenge. In this case, we're going to talk about how revenge backfires. Now, one of my absolute favorite cartoons of all time growing up has to be, and probably what I've learned more from than anything in dealing with problems of life and, even how to build is probably Looney Tunes. If you ever grew up watching Wile E. Coyote and learning about Roadrunner, you probably remember the times, probably learn your lessons in about what revenge looks like and what trying to undermine somebody looks like. But I remember growing up watching that, and no matter what plan the Coyote hatched, the Roadrunner would always be kind of oblivious to it or be able to circumvent his plans. And revenge in a lot of ways is like that. We can seek out the demise of others so often and want the demise of others only to realize that in the end, what we find ourselves doing is hurting ourselves the most. In Proverbs chapter 26 and verse number 27, one of my favorite Proverbs, it says, "Whoso digs a pit shall fall therein, and he that rolls a stone, it will return upon him." Proverbs 26, verse number 27. And the point is that whenever we try to prepare the way for hurting others or for the downfall of others, even in the sense of revenge, a lot of times what ends up happening is we hurt ourselves above all else. And one of the best cases that we can understand this and really see the extent of how true this is comes from the book of Esther. And what we're going to talk about today isn't as much about Esther as it is about a man that finds himself in the story of Esther. Now, if you've never read Esther, if you've never really studied through it, I cannot encourage you enough to do it. I think it's one of my favorite books of the Bible. It's not a very long book. It's very easy to read. But in it, we find so many moral applications of problems that you and I deal with. So I want you to go ahead and open up to Esther and just go to chapter 1. And I want us to kind of zoom in because we don't have time to go through the entirety of the book, even though our story takes our way basically through it all. But we're not going to read it all just for time's sake. But I wanted to go ahead and introduce you to the four main characters of Esther so that whenever you read about them, you know who they are right off the bat. And whenever we introduce them, know they all play a part in the story that we're reading about and talking about. And the first person we'll talk about, his name is Ahasuerus. And whenever you open up and talking about chapter 1, verse number 1, you're going to see the name mentioned of Ahasuerus. Now, Ahasuerus is also called, what we call him secularly, as Xerxes. And you'll see his name called Xerxes from the idea of it more from that time in the Greek word. And whenever we see basically his name given in the Bible, whenever you read about Ahasuerus, just know that it's the same person. Now, whenever you think about Ahasuerus or Xerxes, we probably know him better from secular history than I would say we probably know him from the Bible. If you know about Xerxes and the 300 and Thermopylae and the fighting of the Greeks and Persians, this is the same Xerxes that will assemble the biggest army the world had ever seen to go and try to invade Greece, and who is soundly defeated by the 300 at Thermopylae, and then his naval force is defeated, and then ultimately returns home in defeat. And I think timeline-wise, as we look at where history fits in, I think we find Xerxes at the end of that campaign returning home in Esther chapter 1. And I think that may explain a little bit about what's happening here instead of it just being a random set of events. The next person we're introduced to is obviously Esther. Now, Esther in our story, who is also called Hadassah, she is a Jewish maiden who becomes queen of Persia in part due to her great beauty, but the other part of that due to God's intervention in making her be queen. The other two people we'll find have a very, very stark interaction throughout the story. The first person we'll mention there is Mordecai. Now, Mordecai is Esther's eldest cousin. However, Mordecai is more of a father to Esther, being that her parents were killed in childhood. So he is kind of the father figure to Esther who will raise who will raise her up and really help her along in her journey as far as her being in the Persian courts and everything else happening. Mordecai is also very important to the king very early on, being that he found a plot to assassinate the king and was able to foil that. And so he's very important in the story of both Xerxes and Esther. And then we're introduced to a guy by the name of Haman. Now, Haman is probably the least popular, the least noticeable in all of the figures we're talking about today. But Haman is actually who we're going to focus on more than anybody else this morning. And Haman is this up-and-coming man, very politically minded man, who was elevated and promoted to what's called the chief of all of the king's governors. One of the things you'll find about Ahasuerus/Xerxes, we'll call him Ahasuerus, just know that's the same person, is that he is surrounded very much so by advisors, and he is very loyal, we should say, to the advisors and what they tell him. And we'll find that Haman is a man who's very politically minded. He's very minded in his own, basically, rising up through the ranks of this political governing system we see. And of course, Ahasuerus is the king, and I should have mentioned there, of the Persian Empire. But I want you to go ahead and open up in chapter 1, and we don't really have space on the slides to go through this, so we're going to go through it together, reading about the story of Esther, which is really more so today. We're going to focus on the story of Haman. And I want you to look there in chapter 1. Now, chapter 1 opens up, and we're introduced to Ahasuerus there in verse number 1. And we'll find that Ahasuerus is king over this tremendous empire. If you know anything about the time frame that we're living in before the Greco-Persian Empire is the second round anyways, the Persian Empire is massive. It is truly the definition of an empire. They were the ones that, remember, that toppled the Babylonians. They were the ones that came in and basically took over that portion of the world at the time. And so Ahasuerus, being king over that in chapter 1, opens up with this grand feast. And I think if we put this in perspective, as far as history tells us, if this is actually him coming back from this defeat that he has by the Greeks, he's coming back defeated, angry, in a position where he's trying to reassert dominance on those that are around him. So he hatches this 180-day feast that he's going to try and promote himself, but it really just leads to a drunken feast. And you actually find that in chapter 1, we're introduced to somebody else that precedes Esther, which leads to a lot of the problems we find in the book as far as the king's problems. But in chapter 1, verse number 11, you're introduced to a lady by the name of Vashti. Now, Vashti, we're told in verse number 11, is the queen. Now, the king decides in chapter 1, verse number 12, that she is not going to follow through with his king's drunken commandments. And so in verse number 12, we're told in chapter 1 that the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. One of the things you'll find there throughout the book as we study about Ahasuerus and the king is he is very temperamental. He is very much so. He wears his feelings on his sleeve. He's one of those people that he flies off the handle very easily. And so what he decides to do is basically get rid of Vashti. He's done with her. He sends her off and sends her away. And mind you, Vashti's only wrongdoing was she said no to this king at this very drunken request that he makes. And so at the end of chapter 1, we're told that the king needs to find a new wife. And so in doing so, I want you to go in chapter 2 and look in verse number 7. In chapter 2, whenever the king is searching out for his new wife, decides to basically have a year-long beauty contest, a beauty pageant. And he goes out and he seeks out all of these people from all across places of his kingdom. In verse number 7, we are told about Hadassah. Verse 7 says, he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So this is the first time we're really introduced to Esther. Now, Esther, we're told here, is very fair and beautiful. She's lovely in form and feature. But let's think of a few items about Esther that we know from the story. We know that Esther is probably not the first pick, given her nationality of what would come. And so she was Jewish. We're told in verse number 7, her parents died, and so she was raised up by Mordecai as his own daughter. Now, all of the girls, as you go through and you read chapter 2, are basically given 12 months of beauty treatments. And the king's job at the end of that is to find out who is going to be the most beautiful. And so as you see there, and as you go down through chapter 2, you'll find that each maid is placed before the king, and Esther is going to end up winning. We find the king was more attracted to Esther than any of the other women, and so she wins his approval. And I go through this quickly to really get us to the core of our story today, talking about the problem of revenge. And so as you read through that, not long after that is when Mordecai, who was, remember, Queen Esther's cousin, discovers the plot that they're going to try to assassinate the king and is able to foil it. And his name, remember this, his name is going to be written in and recorded in the records of the king. Now, I want you to go to chapter 3. And chapter 3, after all of this has taken place, read verse 1 through 5 with me, chapter 3. So after all of these events, Esther is set up as queen. Mordecai has already performed this great deal of being able to foil the plot of killing King Ahasuerus. Verse 1 of chapter 3 says, after these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. After all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said unto Mordecai, why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, and that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matter would stand, for he was told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. Now as you read the end of verse number 5, stop there for a second. So we're told that the king is going to elevate Haman. And he's going to give him this great seat of honor, and he's placed in a seat that's higher above than all of the other nobles. And so Haman, you can see, enjoys this, doesn't he? Because in verse number 2, basically everybody's told of his position, and they're told to revere him and honor him and serve him. And then you see in verse number 2 a problem that occurs. Because the problem is they're all told to revere Haman. One stands alone and refuses to. And we're told at the end of verse number 2, Mordecai neither bowed to him nor had respect or reverence to him. Well, in verse number 3 and 4, you see it kind of going on that this is not something that happened just once. It is an ongoing event, and they're wondering why he is not following through. And we don't have a reason given other than verse number 4 at the end, where Mordecai simply told them that he was a Jew. And I think there's probably a bit more to that. I think probably our point of making this is I think Mordecai probably saw there's more to this than just bowing or giving respect. This is almost borderline worship at this point. And so could have been the case, but for whatever reason, he does not bow, and he tells them it's because he's a Jew. Well, in verse number 5, here we're told a little bit about Haman. And Haman probably reminds us a little bit about Ahasuerus at this point, because in verse number 5, whenever Haman sees that Mordecai refuses to bow, his first reaction is that of wrath. And obviously here Haman is, and he is promoted up to this great seat of power. And whenever Haman learns that why the reason was given of why he's refusing to bow, he says that he's a Jew, that sets Haman down a very dangerous path. He cannot resist this anger. And so Haman is furious, but I want you to look at verse 6. Because Haman's not furious with just Mordecai. Keep reading. It says, and he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. Now, as you stop there at the end of verse number 6, you understand a little bit here about what's happening. Haman is so upset about this event, about Mordecai refusing to bow down, and the reason given there is he's a Jew. He cannot stand it to the point where he sets out a plan to not only get rid of Mordecai, but to now get rid of all of the other people of Mordecai that are in the entirety of the empire. Remember we said earlier, Persia at this point is not this little speck on the map. Persia is the empire of the world at the time. That Ahasuerus has formed the greatest force the world had ever seen to go into Greece. This is not a small place. And so as he hatches this plan in verse number 7, we're told that there's 11 months basically till this plan happens, where they're going to go in and try to exterminate the Jews out of Persia. Read verse 8 and 9 with me of Esther chapter 3. It says, and Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasuries. Now stop at the end of verse number 9. By the way, quick side note here. This is not the first time the Persians have run into problems, at least as far as Haman is concerned, with the Jews. You remember there, the Persians also ran into problems with them under Daniel while Daniel was serving them. So this is not the first occasion there where we see one refusing to bow. And so as this is happening and taking place, Haman proposes a law. And notice there in verse number 8, does he mention who the people is he's getting rid of? Doesn't he? He says, no, there's these certain people. And you know they've got a problem. These people are all over your kingdom. They're in all your provinces. He says their laws do not match up to ours, which if you know the Persians, you know that above all else, they care about their laws. They uphold their laws above all else. And just look at the book of Daniel for an example of that. They do not break their laws. And so Haman says there's these people there. They've got their own set of laws. And he says in verse number 8, the problem with that is they don't keep your laws. They don't keep the king's laws. Therefore, he says, it is not for the king's profit to suffer. Basically, he says, you need to get rid of them. You need to be done with them, because the only thing they're doing is costing you money. And so in verse number 9, he says, if it please the king, look at what he says to do, let it be written that they may be destroyed. Not only is he willing to go and give this decree of destroying them, he's offering at this point to pay the expenses of the removal of these people. You wonder how mad is Haman at this slight that Mordecai has given him. He says, it doesn't matter the cost. I will pay 10,000 talents of silver. That is an extraordinary amount of money. He's not saying, I've got 50 to chip in. He's saying, I have millions upon millions I will give you, in our terms, to get rid of these people, to be done with them. And so, rather than being bothered with the details, I want you to look at verse 10. Because verse 10, you keep reading, and the king's not too concerned. You know, that sounds good. And for all the things Haman was, he was an excellent politician, at least at this point, because he phrases it in the way, by the way, who would also fall under this category of Mordecai's people? Probably the king's wife, wouldn't it? And so Haman is very careful to not spill too much about what he's doing. In verse number 10, we're told the king basically gives him a signet ring. And now we say that, we say, what is he talking about? He gives Haman a blank check. And he basically doesn't look through the laws given. And in fact, in verse number 11, he's not even concerned with Haman paying the cost. He says, I'll cover that. And so as you go down and read through the end of it, finally we are told in verse number 13 that exactly what Haman wanted to pass this law, by the way, it's 11 months from that point, goes and it is passed. Look there in verse number 15. It says, the post went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan the palace. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. Now, as you read the end of chapter 3, and you think, well, why is it taking so long? Well, remember, the Persian Empire is not this small city that's a hole in the wall where you can round about. It's a tremendous expanse of the place, and so I'm sure a lot of planning has to go into the extermination of these people. We'll go into chapter 4 now. Chapter 4, we go back to this guy we remember. We go back to Mordecai. Verse number 4, we're told, when Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and a bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. As you see at the end of verse 3, it's now not confusing to the Jews what's about to happen. This picture of them in sackcloth and ashes, that's mourning. You know, this is tremendous mourning that they're going through, that they're trying and seeing, well, this is going to be the end. We're going to be exterminated. And everywhere in verse number 3 that they get this letter, they're devastated. They're devastated at what's about to happen. And so, verse number 4, we finally see someone begin to hesitate. So Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told it, and the queen exceedingly grieved. And she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai and to take away sackcloth from him, but he received it not. Then called Esther for Hattach, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and gave him a commandment to Mordecai to know what it was and why it was. So Hattach went forth to Mordecai into the streets of the city, which was before the king's gate, and Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him, and of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy him, and destroy them. Also, he gave him a copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and to declare it unto her, to charge her that she should go in unto the king, to make supplication unto him, and to make request before him for her people. And Hattach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Again, Esther spake unto Hattach, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of him to be put to death, except to such whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words. As you stop at the end of verse number 12, Mordecai basically sends word to Esther. And he says, you've got to go in and you've got to tell the king what is exactly that is happening. But Esther hesitates, and she gives us the reason in verse number 11 of why she hesitates. Now, I want to stop for a second. You say, well, obviously it's his wife, and why is this happening? Remember, the Persians, above all else, love one man, and that's their laws. And I don't think we can at this point say that Ahasuerus the king is this good, rational, moral person at this point. We're told a lot about Ahasuerus, and we're told that his anger gets the best of him a lot. Has he already gotten rid of one queen? He has in the first chapter. First time we meet him, he's gotten rid of one. And so Esther says, the penalty if I do this, if he doesn't basically pardon me, it's death. And so verse number 13 and 14, and this is Mordecai's warning to Esther. He says, this is what's going to happen if you don't do this. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? As you read verse number 14, Mordecai tells her, he says, if you don't do something now, there's nothing else that can be done. And you read verse number 14, and you wonder, well, how much was God's hand involved at this point in the story of Esther and in all of the events that led to Esther being queen? And Mordecai's point to her was this: you were placed for such a moment as this. Who knows if this is not why the reason you are here? I think a lot of times, as we read about these things taking place and the events unfolding, that Esther's in the perfect place, the perfect time, not just simply by her own doing, but by the hand of God. And so Esther, it says in 15, she sends word back to go to Mordecai, and she is going to do it. But she does give kind of a prescription for Mordecai to follow as she's going to do this. She says in verse 16, go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So that's what happens. She goes and accepts her fate. She goes in and says, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And so Esther goes in, as you go through in chapter 5, Esther goes in and she meets with the king. And the king, to her relief, sees that she's troubled, sees that there is a problem happening, and he offers her up to anything in his kingdom, up to half of his kingdom. So he wants to know what is bothering her. But all she asks for at this point in chapter 5 is for the privilege of having the king and Haman over for dinner. And so the king obliges. And at dinner they go, and they ask her again, well, what's bothering you? Well, she says, we'll do the same thing, and the next night I'll tell you. But Haman is not necessarily just satisfied with that. Go to verse number 9 of chapter 5. Haman is on top of the world at this point. He's had dinner now, and he's invited a second time to have dinner with the king and queen by himself. And it says he is joyful with a glad heart. But as he's leaving dinner, he goes and he sees in his mind, his arch enemy. And he sees Mordecai. And he is furious that he sees Mordecai. If you read verse number 9 through 14, you'll find that Haman goes and he is so upset seeing Mordecai again that he has gallows made, which are the hangman's noose, to get finally rid of Mordecai once and for all. He cannot stand him again. And by the way, verse number 14, it says, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high. That is ridiculous in terms of how tall that is. Okay, you know, a gallows, if you think about how tall a person is, at 20 foot high is going to be tall. And if you think of a cubit is, you know, anywhere from 14 to 18 inches, and he's saying 50 of that, think how high this silly thing is for this one person. But he wants to make a show of him. He cannot stand it. But at the end of verse 14, there's a problem. Because it says, and the king pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. Now, the king goes along with this. He allows it to be made. Can't imagine how much wood went into this just for all of this that he had done. But as you continue reading, and you'll go through chapter 6, tells us that Mordecai is in fact remembered finally. The king, it tells us in chapter 6, has problems sleeping. And as he has problems sleeping, and I think probably making an effort to put him back to sleep, he wants his records to be read back to him. And in his records, he's reminded of this guy, Mordecai, that saved him all the way back, as we read in chapter 1, which has been years ago at this point. And so he goes back and he is reminded of this guy, Mordecai, and he asks, well, what did I give him? Well, he finds out he didn't give him anything. And so he's crushed at this moment. He's crushed that he didn't do anything. And so he goes and he says, listen, we've got to do something. We've got to reward this guy. And he sends out his servant. He says, I want you to get the highest ranking person you can find, and you go bring them to me because we've got to do something about it. And so just as Haman is walking in to seek permission to hang Mordecai, the servant rushes out and gets Haman. And Haman is rushed into the king. In chapter 6, verses 6 through 10, for time's sake, we won't read it. But he is told, instead of asking the king permission to hang Mordecai, he is told to parade him through the streets. And finally, we get to chapter 7, and he barely has time to recover from this. Imagine his frustration before it's time for his banquet with the queen. And so all of the effort that Haman has made to this point of trying to get rid of Mordecai, trying to get rid of the Jews, and it has led us to this moment in chapter 7. What do you think is going to happen? Well, in chapter 7, we are told that the Esther finally tells the king what's bothering her. That's in verses 3 through 6. So as she is telling the king who is bothering her, she says in verse 4 and 5 about the decree that had been passed. And the king said, who would have the audacity to attach such a decree? In verse 6, and guess who's sitting at dinner with them? In verse number 6, Esther says, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Now, that's probably the most stressful dinner you've ever been to. It's just those three, and there's Haman sitting there. And Haman, by the way, has just led Mordecai through the streets, the guy that he built the gallows for. And so you can imagine at this point that the king, it says in verse 7, he's so mad, he storms out. And as we're told, the king is obviously, he's very determined in his anger and just leaves. But he sees in verse number 7, he's going to do something about it. Verse number 8, he returns, and Haman, for whatever reason, and by the way, whether or not, maybe he's petitioning Esther for his life, whatever the case is, in verse number 8, to make matters worse, the king comes back, and where is Haman? Haman has fallen upon the bed where Esther was. And at this point, the king doesn't even, can you imagine the king? We already were told he gets mad. But he is furious at this point. And so as you get to verse number 9, you want to find out what revenge buys you. It is this. And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. So they hang Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. Now, Mordecai, as you continue through the end of the book, Mordecai is promoted. He replaces Haman. But remember, the Persians, they do not go back on their laws. So the law that Haman put into play is still in order. But they do add an extra law that allows the Jews to defend themselves without any retribution when the time comes. And as you read through the end of it, they do so, triumph over their enemies successfully. And everything we have learned, we learn a lot about Haman, revenge, the problem of seeking so much after one person's demise that it led to a people's demise. What did we learn about Haman? Well, I think one of the greatest things we see in Haman's story was it was his pride that brought him low. He didn't think anybody could do anything to him. He was this elevated prince over all the governors. He was the greatest person, except maybe the king and queen. And he thought he could do anything And he lived his life in such a way as he could do anything. But what are we told in Proverbs? If not, pride goes before the fall. We're told that in the Old Testament and the New. And we're told that over and over again. But Haman also had a problem because he took offense where none was given. You know, here he is. He's going to kill an entire race of people. Why? Because one man slighted him. You know, sometimes, and you say, well, you know, I've wanted the demise of a lot of people or wanted vengeance against them. I can't say I've done this. No, but there's a lot of times maybe we go overboard for a perceived slight that people have. And we allow it to eat upon us. We allow it to fester. We allow it to do these things that cause us that we obsess over the idea of getting back at somebody or causing demise of them because maybe they have slighted us. And this is the idea, you know, from the time we're young, where if you hurt me, I'll hurt you back. Well, in this case, Haman really has no reason to do this. But he's so perceived with what is done, he lets it take hold of him so much that this revenge course he sets himself on leads to him being hanged by the same hangman's noose he had prepared for his enemy. Revenge is the same way for you and I today. It will destroy our lives because we will spend our lives seeking after something that will not profit ourselves. And we will spend time, energy, and effort doing that. Can you imagine for a moment, if Haman was as influential as he was, can you imagine for a second the good he could have done? Can you imagine for a moment how productive he could have done? But instead, he spends his life's duty trying to ruin one man. Another bad thing and sad thing we see about revenge is that it oftentimes bleeds over to those people who aren't part of it. And it bleeds over and it affects the people that are around us in a situation. And that's exactly what Haman's hatred did. In the end, Haman could not let go of his hatred. And in the end, Haman was hanged from the same gallows that he had prepared. You know, whenever we think about the life that we live and going through and dealing with people, there's a lot of times we may be tempted to spend our time and energy trying to hurt those people who hurt us back. We've told here, and we've seen the story of Haman. Haman's story doesn't just happen once. Haman's story has happened throughout time and can happen to you and I today if we are not careful. Don't spend our time so consumed with the downfall of someone else that we miss the reason that we are here. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verse number 9, we are told the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations and to reserve the unjust until the day of judgment to be punished. It is God's job to return to them based on the life they have lived. It's not ours. And so as we go through our lives and as we live this, and maybe we have a person or a thing in mind that really rubs us the wrong way and that really we are spending a lot of time and effort on. Look here at what happened to Haman. And even if this doesn't happen to us physically, and it may be as dramatic of an affair as what happened with Haman, revenge will always backfire, whether today or going into eternity. And so how are we living our life then? Godly people, friends, they're going to be persecuted. The wicked people are going to have their way. But we're told ultimately to remain faithful. What a lesson we have in the story of Haman and Esther, and talking about how a life that is so wasted, today how are we spending ours? You know, hopefully, as we've gone through this, we know and have a little bit more to think about this week. But one thing ultimately we need to be thinking about is our obedience to God. That today, if I want to serve God, I cannot do that unless I have obeyed Him and I have followed Him in becoming a Christian. But maybe the second side of this is maybe I am a Christian and maybe I've read through this and realized that a lot of times I thought I was Mordecai and instead I've been Haman. I have sought after the demise of others to the detriment of myself. What a day today to make those things right, to make that change, to look into my life and think, how much better off will I be if I spend my life working on something productive instead of the demise of others? Today the invitation is yours. If we can help you in any way,